TopMedTalk. Hi, I'm Monty Mythen, Editor-in-Chief of TopMedTalk. Welcome to the Trainees with an Interest in Perioperative Medicine, TRIPOM. Any questions? Live from the IET Savoy Place in London at the closing of the EBPOM 2018 Annual Congress. I'm joined by co-host Desiree Chappell and special guests Dr. Padma Gulur from Duke University Medical Center in the United States of America, and Dr. Natasha Curran from University College London Hospitals in the UK. Now, they're both experts in clinical pain management with a subspecialist interest in chronic pain conditions. They're both speaking in the last session at EBPOM 2018. We're also joined by John Whittle, who is one of the founders of TRIPOM, who's now an assistant professor at Duke University Medical Center, having recently crossed the pond. We'll be bringing that into discussion. And Katie Samuel, who's co-chair of TRIPOM and also a Perioperative Medicine Fellow at University College London Hospitals. Now, we've been collecting questions using an online voting system for the last few days, and we're going to start with opioid questions. But before I do that, I just want to turn to John and Katie to tell us a little bit about TRIPOM. John, what's it all about?
Well, thanks for having us. So TRIPOM is a trainee-led organisation. TRIPOM stands for Trainees with an Interest in Perioperative Medicine. We are an education-focused group, so an educational collaborative. The goal being to use all that energy that doctors in training have to produce some high-quality educational materials for global consumption. So we are mostly web and social media based, but also now have presence at meetings.
And your website, John, which I know you put a lot of energy into, it's very beautiful.
So we have a new website, it's www.tripom.org. We encourage you to visit it, take some ideas from it and get back to us with what you want to do.
And all open source?
All open source, free at the point of access.
Great stuff. So John, what's it been like going to America?
It's been a culture shock. Having trained 100% in the UK, come through the UK system. I'm working in intensive care, so surgical intensive care and anaesthesia and perioperative medicine at Duke. The anaesthesia system is very different from what I'm used to over this side of the pond in the UK. Has its unique challenges and its unique benefits as well. And surgical ICU is very different, a semi-closed system from a fully closed system, which I'm used to.
And you get the opportunity to pay more tax, don't you?
I get the opportunity to pay plenty of tax. Yeah.
We'll gloss over that because they pay you more money, that's why. Katie, welcome, co-chair of TRIPOM.
Yes, thank you. I echo John's sentiments. Thank you for having us.
Excellent. Any more you'd like to add about TRIPOM itself?
Well, it's something that's continuing to grow. TRIPOM's existed for 3 years now, and we've seen it come from just a small group of interested trainees to, as John said, being an international programme. And what we're keen to do is to keep everything free access at the point of contact and really grow our educational resources. And so far, it's been really positive response from trainees who really enjoy partaking in writing these things, but also in using them for their education.
Great, thank you very much. So, Padma Gulur, if I may, we've been a guest on TopMedTalk before, but I think this is your first visit to an EBPOM meeting, or your second visit to an EBPOM meeting?
My second visit, but more comprehensive. So first true visit, I should say.
And what did you, this is a loaded question, what did you make of the meeting?
Well, first of all, thank you, Monty, very much for inviting me. This has been a phenomenal opportunity, but to see just the content, the quality of the speakers, just the general interactive nature of the meeting has been phenomenal. It is by and far one of the most enjoyable meetings I've been to. I've learned a lot from it as well, and which will affect my practice moving forward, and you can't ask for more than that from any conference that you attend. Seeing this, TRIPOM, seeing the trainees interested and given a opportunity really to advance this field starting now is amazing, and I wish them all the best, and I hope to see you guys grow bigger and stronger and even more international, and hopefully we can help encourage folks from our side of the pond, expensive side of the pond, help out as well, participate in this.
Right now, and you've been again exposed to very, very typical London English weather. The sun's been shining almost continuously. What do you think about England's chances in the Football World Cup? And do you understand the question?
I do understand the question. I actually saw that penalty shootout, and a few before then that didn't work out. So it's awesome. It's fantastic. It's the team you're rooting for right now, to win. And as you said, the weather seems to indicate that things can happen.
Well, I mean, on the basis of the fact that rare things happen rarely, I suppose the common things happen commonly, the fact that England, the penalty shootout thing we all got stressed about the other night, that would strongly indicate that it's probably going to stay sunny till the end of August. Natasha Curran, old friend of EBPOM, young in years, but been a friend for a long time. Any reflections on the meeting from you before we get into the questions?
I just love being back, I have to say, being back in the embrace of perioperative medicine, because as time goes on as a pain physician, you do kind of less of anaesthesia, but it's always nice to think that you can give something back to the parent specialty and to still be relevant. And I think that one of the things that I've really enjoyed about perioperative medicine as it's evolved, it's always been there, if you like, but how the emphasis it has now is how much pain is being really taken seriously. Sounds a bit silly, but it's really been taken, it's being used to drive outcomes, which is close to my heart. So it's great.
Excellent. So we're just going to very quick voice check from Desiree Chappell here, my co-host, because we'll be hearing more from you later. Desiree, how's it been for you?
It's been great. The meeting is amazing. And the speakers, the international speakers, it's always wonderful to hear perspectives from across the world and to know that some things that you're doing are progressive and then other things that you're doing may not be so progressive. So it's a kind of a reality check, but it's a good one. And I don't believe you when you say that London weather is horrible. Every time I've been here, it's beautiful and sunny.
Must be you, Desiree.
You're obviously not coming often enough. So, as I said, we've had an online voting system open for the last few days. We've also had the system going in the main meeting. And the first question I've got here is there an opioid crisis, and is it unique to the United States of America? Padma.
There is an opioid crisis. It's heightened in the United States of America. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We are well in the midst of it and feeling the consequences of generally ignoring it for too many years. We're trying to recover from that right now. Does it affect anyone other than the United States? I must admit, I am a little concerned seeing trends in other countries right now. It seems delayed, but definitely there's some red flags when we see utilization in some sister countries like Canada. Here in the United Kingdom, I'm learning, some early signs of where the United States used to be some years ago. And so I do believe that the lessons learned in the United States should be applied broadly.
So, I mean, one of the observations is it's been flagged up as a crisis in the United States of America with some very shocking statistics, such that perhaps you're ahead of the game in recognizing it, therefore perhaps you're ahead of the game in getting corrective measures in place, including legislation, including changes in laws. Is that possible?
Yeah, I would agree that we are definitely ahead in terms of coming up with the solutions at this point, simply because the problem is so much larger and so much more advanced there in the United States. And these solutions that we're coming up with, two things: preventative. Can we make sure that lessons learned from the United States? The first thing would be that no one does what we did, in other countries where the focus on opioids, the easy way out for pain management, that approach does not take root in other societies. And then the second part is, if there are such signs, early signs, some of the solutions we've come up with could actually help prevent it from becoming a larger scale problem.
With your prescribing habits, which has been quite a lot of criticism related to that, and the leak of drugs into the community, the secondary positioning of drugs, we've seen some quite shocking documentaries and footage about these things called pill mills. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yes.
Is that become an industry in some places?
It is. It is actually, I don't know how many people know, but there's a county in Florida, Broward County, and they're famous for two things. One was when George Bush and, won his election, we went all the way to the Supreme Court because the people in Broward County couldn't push the paper far enough, and they were hanging chads, as they were called. And so the votes had to be counted and recounted and then recounted, and then a decision finally made by the court on who wins. The other thing Broward County is famous for is pill mills. So it is a Florida county, so it's where a lot of the older population or retired population tends to live. And the statistic there that's alarming is there are more pain clinics, prescribing pain clinics, than there are fast food restaurants. And that's saying something for the United States, per se. So there were almost 90 pain clinics within a very small area.
And that's the industrialized repositioning of drugs for secondary financial gain. And a lot of the fingerprints on that are by fully qualified physicians.
Absolutely. If you ever want to see something entertaining that can tell you how far this can go, just Google Starbucks doctor. It's an LA Starbucks doctor. This is a physician who opened shop in a Starbucks, in a coffee shop. He had a computer, he had a stethoscope, and I believe there was even a blood pressure cuff. If he needed to take it, but that's where he would meet patients and prescribe for cash. And that person did get, prosecuted, etc. But that's another example of this kind of a pill mill culture, which is basically, providing prescriptions without appropriate indication and appropriate, evaluation.
So, Natasha, to bring you back to the question, is there a crisis and is it unique to the USA?
It's definitely not unique to the USA. And UK is, the stats show that our opioid use is increasing. The deaths from opioids, not just from prescription opioids, but then people converting to street drugs is increasing rapidly. I very much welcome the media attention on this because I think that recognising the problem is the start. And it's not just for doctors and healthcare professionals to know about it, it is for the public. And I think the measures that one has to put into place to avert an opioid crisis are, in our words, multimodal and system level. We can't just legislate our way to stop opioids because that actually we also see in other parts of the world where patients have no access to opioids. That's not a solution either. So we have to be very careful about how we institute the changes to enable a measured and appropriate use of opioids.
And have there been changes in society? There are always changes in society, but we appear to have, and I think the stats support this, fewer police visible on the streets compared to 2010, for example. That's my local suburban London experience, and the local shop owners tell me that the increase in growth, there's always going to be drug dealers around, secondary dealers of opportunity, but they said they're almost outnumbering the shops now, and seeing a uniformed police officer has become very rare. And as far as I know, in the Met, the number of arrests since 2010 has gone down by half to 2017. Not related to drugs, just the overall stat. Stable for a number of years and then down to half. I'm not an expert in this, I'm just sharing concerns as a father. Is there any suggestion that that's part of it as well?
I don't know about the policing in Britain having effect, because the other thing is that you don't need, with advents of so many technologies now, you don't need to be selling drugs on the street, And actually, I wonder, Padma, if you wanted to share some of the things that you've experienced in Duke about how this is not a population that we would think that are sort of your children, Monty, that are kind of experimenting with drugs. These are often people that have then had their opioids stopped in an effort to reduce the kind of opioid crisis, but actually they're now addicted to that medicine and they want to find it. Padma, can I hand over to you at that point about what's happening in the States?
We actually are seeing the entire spectrum. So one, the excess prescription that we've done over the years has led to a large amount of, shall we say, freely available prescription opioid in the community, and that's affecting our children. It is affecting our as children as young as in elementary school, who have been given access to these drugs. The way that it's marketed to them is actually, nefarious and quite heart-wrenching when you find out that they put it in brownies and then sell these brownies or offer these brownies to these children, similar to what had happened with tobacco in the beginning, which is expose them to it. So then they need it, and because they need it, they will buy the brownies. Now they'll find ways to purchase the brownies from these folks, etc. So that's one end of the spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum, of course, is that the patients who are in pain or perceive themselves in pain and get dependent on these medications, and when the access to that is limited, they turn to these street drugs. One of the major issues, the reasons that while we speak of prescription drug abuse, the other thing to recognize is that illicit drugs have become very, very easy to access. They're very cheap. In fact, it is a very expensive habit. Prescription drug abuse is an expensive habit. It costs a lot. And so people who can't afford it after a while have to turn to illicits because it's way cheaper. Unfortunately, it's not a standardized process, and therefore they are exposed to more deaths. We, for instance, our biggest problem in the United States right now, illicit, is actually fentanyl, because we have fentanyl laced everything. And that is causing the increase in overdose deaths that we're seeing.
So John Whittle, having crossed the Atlantic and being relatively young, got to be careful how I phrase this now. What are your perspectives on this? The opioid crisis, and is it a unique US phenomenon?
I can only talk on observation, obviously, from that point of view, but it's certainly more prominent in the US. Before I left for across the pond, my general impression was, well, that's kind of something simmering maybe in some areas of the UK, but, big deal wasn't made. The first day I went into the theatres, the ORs in Duke, I was presented with an opioid-free anaesthetic plan for one of my patients, and the conversation has continued since then. So that it's very prominent, that side of the pond.
Is that the concept of the opioid-free anaesthetic? Is that an overreaction? Is that where the real issue lies? I got the impression it was more about how many tablets people were going home with, not the 100 of fentanyl and induction of anaesthesia.
So that's I think a really important question, isn't it? So how, and obviously our experts are going to be able to talk better to this, but how does intra-operative opioid use then translate into post-operative opioid consumption, and not just within the hospital, but then what do you go home with? Certainly, again, observationally and from what I've read, prescribing habits and the way that opioids are prescribed in the United States is very different from here. The surgical teams will often, in fact, almost exclusively prescribe post-operative analgesia. So as part of my day-to-day anesthesia job there, I don't write the post-operative floor opioid or analgesia plans. And again, the way that they are prescribed for going home with is, again, observationally very different. Historically, a big bottle, I think Padma may have something to say on this.
Padma, do you want to come back on that?
So, great points, John. In the time that you've been there, obviously, you can see that it is a major concern. Do I feel opioid use, intraoperative opioid use influences or has the potential to influence postoperative courses? Yes. Do I think that opioid-free anesthesia is necessary across the board? No. I think, as with most things, the answer is in moderation, appropriate patient selection, and appropriate use of these medications. But it's also not the other way, which is it doesn't matter what I use intraoperatively, it's not going to have an impact. In fact, it does. Remifentanil is a good example, the tachyphylaxis that can develop from that, and then the use of needing to use larger and larger doses of opioids in the immediate period afterwards. That can have an influence, because from there starts the high-dose opioid prescribing for these patients. So that's just one example. As far as one versus the other, I think they all contribute, and they contribute equally. We should be thoughtful throughout the process.
So Katie, you are still a trainee, and you're a very experienced doctor. You've been a doctor for a number of years now. You're a fellow in perioperative medicine. What's it like from your perspective?
Well, the first thing to say is I've never worked in the States, so I can't really comment on that, although it's very interesting to hear how different in many ways the care provided there is, especially with surgical-led prescribing. But I think in the UK, as the other panellists have commented, there's certainly the hint that opioid epidemics is becoming an issue. And you see that not just in ED with overdoses, but with people who are readmitted, who you've perhaps sent home and then find that they're coming back still on the same medications that you weren't necessarily expecting them to still be on. And I think one thing that the UK doesn't do very well is necessarily education around this, particularly with doctors coming through training. It's not really brought up at med school beyond a kind of a cursive moment to kind of say that opioid addiction is a thing that occurs, and it's often talked about in receptors rather than in terms of the physical, clinical implications for patients. And I think that's something that, certainly from learning from the opioid epidemic in the US, that's something that we need to take on board here.
And certainly, I mean, one of the things that was emphasised in my training is don't worry how much opioid you give to a patient who's in pain, because you can never make them an addict.
Yes, I think that's a message that is still probably conveyed for the most part. With that in mind, there is, with ERAS and multimodal analgesia becoming more of a standardised process, we tend to find that over the 10 years I've been practicing that we do use less opiates intra-op at least, because we have more regional techniques that we're better at and we're becoming more familiar with using. But still, the general belief, I think, amongst most trainees is that if a patient's in pain, you give opiates, if opiates are appropriate for them. And that's something perhaps we need to look at.
So we're going to move on to our next question, but I just want to point out, if anyone would like to make a comment or ask a question from the audience amassed here, then please do identify yourself. So would you like to make a comment now?
Just with regard to opioid-free anaesthesia, we're talking about an opioid epidemic, but there's, from what I understand, part of it is related to cancer outcomes, and I just wondered what the feeling was with regard with how you felt. Is there a problem with opioids and cancer outcomes, and do you feel it's significant and something we should be taking more seriously in general?
Padma?
I think it's early with the cancer. I mean, is there data? Yes, especially with the lung, lung-related cancers, and that there is data that metastases, metastatic episodes are increased in patients who are exposed to opioids, and the concept there being the immunosuppression that these drugs can cause, and is that what's promoting any of this? That said, the evidence on that is still early. And cancer-related pain is pretty significant, and I don't think it's just the surgical episode. It's used past that episode. It's not a good place to be. When you hurt as bad as that, and that's a good example of what Natasha said in FERS. There are many countries in the world that will not offer pain relief to those patients because of legislations that don't allow access to these medications. So again, a more thoughtful, balanced approach would be there. That said, are there ways we can mitigate this? Well, intrathecal drug delivery systems, where we can get the analgesia for a much smaller dose. And in fact, there's a paper by Smith that shows improved survival in patients with cancer who are given intrathecal pumps compared to conservative medical management. So there's potential over there for us. Again, not quite opioid-free, but minimal doses or more optimal doses may be the answer given the current evidence in cancer patients.
We have another question on this subject.
Thanks. It's just to pick up on Katie's points about education. I think certainly in this country, we're not that far from surgical prescribers in that our patients go to the ward and then the prescribing is taken on by very junior doctors who we need to really educate, because they're the ones who are writing the TTOs and they're the ones who are sending patients out of hospital, who are, when you talk to them, very unsure about what they're doing. And I think we need to target the messaging and the education to them, or take it over ourselves.
So Katie, anything TRIPOM's doing about the education in this space?
Yes, actually, a lot of our educational content is based on perioperative topics, and certainly the importance of multimodal analgesia is a topic that we've written on and published. And I think Anne-Marie's completely right that it is looking at the people physically doing the prescribing, because you can educate kind of the higher members of the team, but actually if you're not getting to the people who are actually doing the job, it's not going to make a difference. So there is lots of available on that topic.
So John, you commented on who was doing the prescribing as well, comparing the UK to the US, but it is interesting here that it's given to a junior who's often quite transient in the teams. Do we need to give this responsibility to an alternative provider who's there more constantly? Like we've done in many other systems, you get it out of the hands of the doctors.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept, and I think we see this across quite a few processes within care. So in the critical care unit, for example, in both sides of the pond, there are now advanced care practitioners who are present and act as continuity, but also as educational resources. I think multidisciplinary pain rounds are completely common on both sides of the pond. I think maybe, and again, there are two doctors here who do this regularly, but I think maybe the educational aspect of that is a key part, and maybe the interaction between the pain teams and the junior doctor teams could be improved in terms of education.
Another question from the floor.
Yeah, just following on really from that point in terms of patient expectation and managing that. In sort of primary care settings, we are following the American sort of way of demanding certain things in litigation, that kind of thing. How would you deal best with patients demanding opioids and expecting that as their pain relief over and above other methods?
So, Natasha.
Okay. That's a brilliant question because it brings up the opportunity in some ways to talk about informed consent around opioids. So when I talk to I do a lot of education, just speaking to John's point, in our pain team with junior doctors, but also general practitioners and other people in the community. And a lot of them are really surprised when they learn that pain doctors very rarely start people on opiates, and we rarely increase them because a lot of things we're doing around pain management are around reducing the drugs and improving the skills to manage pain, particularly in a long-term condition. But your question around, if a patient's demanding it, if a patient was demanding a surgery, you'd be doing an informed consent process around that, or, if you think the surgery is appropriate. And we don't really do it. When I start a patient on opiates in the pain clinic, I do an opioid contract. So I explain to them about all the long-term risks of opioids, which includes hyperalgesia, so more pain when you get to a certain level of opioid, all the things that you know about opioid risk, but things that people are not so aware of about the effects on the hormone systems, the immune system, things that we don't know about, and of course tolerance and addiction. And it's surprising how that focuses patients' minds. And also I set behavioural goals around those things. So my question in the talk we did about EBPOM to the audience was, how many of you consent your patients about the long-term risks of opioids? And if we're thinking about, particularly around litigation or, and the consent process, I think we have to ask ourselves about what information we're giving patients about opioids.
So we're going to switch gears slightly. Excellent discussion there. I think Desiree's got another question that's come in on the online system earlier in the week.
Yeah, so Oxycontin or Oxycodone is probably one of the pills that we talk about with the pill mills. And I know it started as well in like the hills of West Virginia and in very poor areas of this country. And that's where a lot of the overdoses and things like that are happening now. So my question is, the question is should Oxycontin still be prescribed, specifically in that palliative care area, and is it still being prescribed outside of that area?
So I think Oxycontin is actually even more prescribed in the post-operative period, even now. And that's what's concerning, especially orthopedics. A lot of the protocols and the standardization are calling for use of a long-acting agent, and we are seeing more use of Oxycontin in those periods. And I think that is definitely something that should be reconsidered. If you are going to use a opioid, use a less reinforcing medication, use morphine and morphine-based products. You'd be surprised at how many of our providers don't know that a short-acting or instant-release formulation of morphine's even available. Because oxycodone and dilaudid, which is what hydromorphone is known as in the United States, are the go-to drugs for everything. Should it be prescribed? The REMS program, which was started by the FDA, has started to promote more abuse-deterrent formulations. And if those abuse-deterrent formulations are as effective as we're being told, then it could be used. But again, there are alternatives. There's absolutely no need to rely on a drug that can potentially be more addictive for patients, and we should be using other agents when possible.
John, actually, I was going to ask you as well. What is your perspective seeing it on both sides? Did you see it used here in the UK and still seeing your patients come to you on it?
Yes, I think over the last few years we've seen more patients presenting for anaesthesia, already established on Oxycodone and drugs like that. I think there's probably, again, observationally more likely to also see patients this side of the pond on oral morphine, which I see less frequently over in the States, and we don't use Dilaudid, at least not routinely this side of the pond, so that was a new drug for me, but again, quite a few patients in the US present established on Dilaudid.
Natasha, are you prescribing Oxycontin?
Very, very rarely. I don't prescribe it perioperatively. It is used more in cancer pain in this country, but again, we're seeing more and more patients. I did an audit recently showing just the use of patients coming into hospital, just like John said, and actually the GPs and the clinical commissioning groups in Britain now are increasingly concerned about the number of patients that are on Oxycodone. So it's an issue.
And Katie, one of the questions I had for as a trainee and what you're being taught is how do you deal with these patients coming to you on certain types of, the high dose or chronic pain and opioid use patients? How are you being taught to deal with those types of patients and move them through the process and get them out on the other side and see where they end up?
So I think the first thing to say is that certainly we are seeing more and more chronic pain patients coming in for either elective or emergency procedures. And I think that probably most trainees would agree that that's a challenge, because these patients can be very difficult to manage perioperatively in terms of the additional surgical pain. And practice is not always evidence-based, and I would say it varies around the country. It's interesting to hear Natasha say about the fact that she very rarely prescribes Oxycodone, because actually what I've seen from working around the country is that it's a fairly popular second choice to morphine that's actually instituted pretty rapidly if someone's got side effects like feeling sick or itching, etc. So actually I would say from working around in different parts of the country, it's still used pretty regularly. And these aren't necessarily people who are sent home on Oxycodone, but for patients who have chronic pain, whether they are prescribed Oxycodone or morphine, they are a challenge perioperatively.
Do you think we've been getting the same message clearly here? Because I was surprised last week, a number of patients being prescribed post-operatively in our institution, Oxycontin, Oxycodone. Do you think we're not as alert to this fact that it's a very addictive drug? Do you think it's become fashionable now? Because the reason people love it, it's a great pain reliever. It makes you feel, makes you feel fantastic apparently, and has minimal side effects. That's one of the challenges.
I think that from what I've seen, and again I can't comment for all trainees, but certainly there is a lack of awareness on its addictive issues. And as I said, it's often seen as a quick to change to second line for people that have issues with morphine. And especially for people who are elderly, who you're concerned might have significant morbidity with morphine, it's a reasonably common choice. So definitely I feel that the issue needs to be raised in training as well as for postgraduate education too.
Well, thank you. So we're going to be changing topics shortly. We're going to be taking a short break and say goodbye to two of our guests, to Padma Gulur and Natasha Curran, who I think have to get out of here and go and meet some people and discuss important issues in a restaurant or a bar or something like that. So good luck with that. We'll be back shortly with two new guests, and we're going to be moving on to a different subject area. Thank you very much for listening to TopMedTalk. We'll be back soon. TopMed.